The psychology of medieval justice. What's really disturbing is how normal all of this seemed to medieval people. We're talking about societies where public hangings were family entertainment, and where people genuinely believed that physical suffering was good for the soul. Medieval Christianity taught that earthly suffering could lead to heavenly reward, so torture was sometimes seen as doing the victim a favor, helping them atone for their sins before death. This religious justification made even the most horrific practices seem not just acceptable, but morally necessary. The whole system was also based on the idea that truth could only be extracted through pain. Medieval people didn't really understand concepts like false confessions or the unreliability of testimony obtained under duress. If someone confessed during torture, that was considered ironclad proof of guilt. There was also a class element to all of this. Nobles and wealthy merchants could often buy their way out of torture, either through bribes or by hiring champions to undergo trial by combat on their behalf. Torture was primarily used against the poor, the powerless, and the socially marginalized. Regional variations and specializations. Different parts of Europe developed their own special approaches to torture, like some kind of twisted cultural exchange program. The German states were particularly fond of elaborate mechanical devices. They developed things like the strappado, where victims were hung by their arms twisted behind their backs, and the Schandmaske, masks of shame that were locked onto people's heads for various offenses. Spain and the Spanish Inquisition became famous for their systematic approach to torture. They kept detailed records of their sessions and developed specific techniques for different types of suspected crimes. The Spanish were also big fans of the auto da fe, public ceremonies where multiple people were tortured and executed at once. France had its own contributions to the torture toolkit, including the brodequin, a device that slowly crushed the legs, and various forms of the question, their term for judicial torture. French torturers were known for their precision and their ability to keep victims alive through extended sessions. England, believe it or not, was actually somewhat less torture-happy than the rest of Europe, at least officially. English common law was more skeptical of confessions obtained through torture, but they made up for it with creative punishments like being pressed to death with heavy stones. Italy, being the center of the Catholic Church, saw some of the most religiously motivated torture. The Papal States had their own torture chambers, and Italian city-states developed sophisticated systems for dealing with political enemies through prolonged suffering. The business of pain. Here's something that might surprise you. Torture was actually a profession in medieval Europe. There were professional torturers who traveled from town to town, offering their services to local authorities. These guys weren't just sadists. Well, not only sadists. They were skilled craftsmen who knew exactly how to inflict maximum pain without killing their victims too quickly. A good torturer could keep someone alive and conscious for hours or even days, extracting multiple confessions and gathering information about accomplices. Torturer families often passed down their knowledge through generations, like any other medieval craft. They had their own guilds in some cities, with apprenticeship programs and everything. Can you imagine putting professional torturer on your resume? The economics of torture were complicated too. Towns had to pay for these services, maintain torture equipment, and keep torture chambers operational. Some places rented out their torture facilities to neighboring jurisdictions, turning pain into profit. There were even specialized roles within the torture industry. Some people focused on psychological torture, using fear and anticipation to break victims without physical pain. Others specialized in medical torture, keeping victims alive through procedures that would normally be fatal. The victims. Who suffered and why? The reality is that almost anyone could end up in a medieval torture chamber, but some groups were definitely more at risk than others. Religious minorities were constantly targeted. Jews faced periodic persecution and were often tortured during trumped-up trials for everything from well poisoning to blood libel accusations. Muslims in Christian territories faced similar treatment, especially during the Reconquista in Spain. Women accused of witchcraft probably suffered some of the worst tortures in medieval history. The witch trials that peaked in the late medieval and early modern periods involved torture techniques specifically designed for women, often with sexual components that were meant to humiliate as well as cause pain. Political prisoners and rebels faced systematic torture, designed to extract information about conspiracies and to set examples for other potential troublemakers. Medieval rulers understood that torturing one rebel publicly was worth more than killing 10 in private. Common criminals, thieves, murderers, rapists, made up a large portion of torture victims. But the definition of criminal was pretty broad in medieval times. You could be tortured for adultery, for practicing the wrong religion, for speaking against the local lord, or even for being poor and unemployed. Debtors were sometimes tortured to force them to reveal hidden assets, or to get their families to pay up. Merchants accused of fraud faced specific torture techniques designed to make them confess to their business practices and reveal the location of hidden wealth. Resistance and survival, the human spirit under extreme duress. Not everyone just accepted their fate in medieval torture chambers. Some people found ways to resist, and a few even managed to survive and tell their tales. These stories of human resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty provide some of the most compelling and heartbreaking accounts in medieval history. Some victims tried to build up pain tolerance through various methods. There are accounts of people deliberately injuring themselves to prepare for torture, or using meditation and prayer techniques to dissociate from physical pain. The Cathars, for example, developed specific spiritual practices designed to help them endure torture without betraying their faith or fellow believers. One remarkable case involves Marguerite Porete, a French mystic who was tortured by the Inquisition in 1310. She had written a book called The Mirror of Simple Souls that church authorities declared heretical. During her torture, witnesses reported that she seemed to enter a trance-like state, repeating prayers and seemingly oblivious to the physical pain being inflicted on her. She never confessed or recanted her beliefs, despite being tortured over several sessions. She was eventually burned at the stake, but her book survived and influenced mystical thought for centuries. Others tried to game the system by giving false confessions that would satisfy torturers, while not actually incriminating themselves or others. This was incredibly dangerous, because getting caught in a lie usually meant more torture, but some people managed to walk this tightrope successfully. A fascinating example comes from the witch trials in Würzburg, Germany, in the 1620s. A woman named Anna Hansen was accused of witchcraft and subjected to multiple torture sessions. Court records show that she gave increasingly elaborate confessions, claiming to have attended witches' sabbaths with dozens of prominent local citizens, including the bishop's own relatives. Her confessions became so outrageous that even her torturers began to suspect she was making things up to deflect attention from real conspirators. She was eventually released because her confessions were deemed unreliable, though this was extremely rare. Wealthy families sometimes managed to bribe officials or hire lawyers who could find technical loopholes in torture procedures. Medieval law was incredibly complex, and a skilled legal mind could sometimes find ways to delay or prevent torture sessions. The case of Galileo Galilei in 1633 shows how elite connections could sometimes provide protection, even when the charges were serious. Galileo was threatened with torture by the Roman Inquisition for his support of heliocentrism, but he was never actually tortured. His advanced age, his reputation, and his connections with powerful patrons probably saved him from physical torture, though the threat alone was enough to make him recant his scientific positions. There were also cases of rescue attempts, though these were rare and extremely dangerous. Family members or friends sometimes tried to break people out of dungeons before torture sessions, or attempted to bribe guards to allow escapes. One of the most successful rescue operations took place in Prague in 1419, when Hussite supporters stormed the city's torture chambers and freed dozens of their fellow religious reformers who were awaiting torture. This rescue sparked the Hussite Wars, but it also saved the lives of people who would otherwise have been tortured to death. More commonly, rescue attempts involved bribing guards or officials. In Venice in 1573, a wealthy merchant named Marco Grimaldi was arrested for heresy. Before he could be tortured, his family managed to bribe 3 different officials and arrange for him to escape from his cell. He fled to Protestant Geneva, where he wrote detailed accounts of the Inquisition's methods, accounts that were later used by Protestant reformers to criticize Catholic practices. Some victims found ways to die before their torture sessions, either through suicide or by deliberately provoking guards into killing them quickly. While this might seem like giving up, in the context of medieval torture, A quick death was often seen as a victory. The chronicles of the Albigensian Crusade record several cases of Cathar perfect who managed to kill themselves rather than face torture. In one case at the Castle of Bram in 1210, over 20 Cathars threw themselves from the castle walls when they realized capture was inevitable. Their co-religionists considered this a form of martyrdom that preserved their spiritual purity. Perhaps most remarkably, some people actually survived extensive torture and lived to tell about it. These survivors often became powerful witnesses against the systems that had tormented them, though speaking out put them at risk of further persecution. One of the most detailed survivor accounts comes from Johannes Junius, who was tortured during the Bamberg witch trials in 1628. Junius was a former mayor who was accused of witchcraft by other torture victims who named him under duress. He was subjected to multiple torture sessions, including thumbscrews, leg vices, and the strappado. What makes Junius's case unique is that he managed to smuggle a letter out of prison describing his torture in detail. The letter, written to his daughter, explains how the torture was so unbearable that he eventually confessed to being a witch just to make it stop. He wrote, "They never leave off with the torture till one confesses something he has never done." He was executed before his letter could save him, but the document survived and provides one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of medieval torture we have. Another survivor, a woman named Katharina Henot from Cologne, was tortured for witchcraft in 1627, but managed to survive when her family's political connections finally intervened. She had been subjected to multiple torture sessions over several months, including having her thumbs crushed and being stretched on the rack. After her release, she spent years trying to get her name officially cleared and seeking compensation for her suffering. Her persistence eventually led to reforms in how witch trials were conducted in the region. Some torture survivors became advocates for reform or found ways to help other victims. In Spain, a converso named Luis de Leon was tortured by the Inquisition in 1572 for translating religious texts into Spanish. He survived nearly 5 years of imprisonment and periodic torture sessions. After his release, he wrote extensively about his experiences and became a secret supporter of other Inquisition victims, using his position as a university professor to help people avoid persecution. The survival strategies that worked varied greatly depending on the circumstances, but certain patterns emerged from the historical records. Maintaining some form of hope or purpose seemed crucial. Survivors often mention having something or someone to live for. Strong religious faith, whether Christian, Jewish, or heretical, provided psychological resources for enduring pain. Social connections, whether family, religious community, or professional networks, could provide practical help and emotional support. Physical factors also mattered. Younger victims generally had better chances of survival, as did those who weren't subjected to the most severe tortures. Confession, even if false, often ended torture sessions and improved survival odds, though it came at the cost of integrity and potentially implicated others. What's most striking about these survival stories is how they demonstrate the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Even under the most extreme conditions imaginable, people found ways to maintain their humanity, protect others, and sometimes even resist their oppressors. These accounts remind us that even in history's darkest moments, individual courage and dignity could shine through. The beginning of the end. So how did Europe eventually move away from torture as a standard judicial practice? It wasn't a sudden change. It took centuries and happened for a combination of reasons. The Renaissance brought new ideas about human dignity and the reliability of evidence obtained through torture. Scholars began to question whether confessions extracted through pain were actually trustworthy, and some began to argue that torture was incompatible with Christian values of mercy and forgiveness. The rise of more centralized governments also played a role. As kingdoms became more organized and bureaucratic, there was less need for dramatic public displays of power. Professional law enforcement and court systems began to replace the chaotic patchwork of medieval justice. The Protestant Reformation challenged many Catholic practices, including some forms of religious torture. While Protestant countries developed their own forms of persecution, they generally moved away from the elaborate torture systems associated with the Inquisition. Perhaps most importantly, The Enlightenment brought philosophical arguments against torture based on human rights and the unreliability of coerced confessions. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria wrote influential works arguing that torture was both immoral and ineffective. But we should be clear. The end of institutional torture in Europe was a gradual process that took place over several centuries. Some forms of judicial torture continued into the 18th and even 19th centuries in parts of Europe. Legacy and lessons. The history of medieval torture leaves us with some uncomfortable questions about human nature and the dangers of unchecked authority. How could entire societies not only tolerate but actively participate in such systematic cruelty? Part of the answer lies in how torture was justified and normalized. When authorities, whether religious or secular, convince people that extreme measures are necessary for the greater good, ordinary individuals can become complicit in extraordinary evil. The medieval period also shows us how quickly civilized behavior can break down when legal protections are weak and when certain groups are dehumanized. The same communities that produced great art, literature, and philosophy also created some of the most sophisticated torture techniques in human history. But there's also something to be said for how far we've come. The fact that most of us find medieval torture practices horrifying and incomprehensible shows that human moral progress is possible, even if it's slow and uneven. The legal protections we take for granted today, the right to remain silent, protection from self-incrimination, the presumption of innocence, these developed partly as reactions against the horrors of medieval justice systems. Modern parallels and continuing vigilance. While we like to think we've moved beyond the barbarism of medieval torture, the truth is more complicated. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, torture has continued to be used by governments around the world, often with the same justifications used in medieval times: national security, extracting truth, deterring crime. The techniques may have evolved, but the underlying logic remains disturbingly similar. Authorities still sometimes argue that extreme situations require extreme measures, and that the greater good justifies individual suffering. What's different today is that we have international laws and institutions designed to prevent torture, along with human rights organizations that document and oppose these practices. We also have a better understanding of why torture doesn't work. Modern psychology has confirmed what some medieval critics suspected. People will say anything to stop pain, making torture-induced confessions unreliable. But vigilance is required to maintain these protections. History shows us how quickly societies can slide back into accepting practices they once considered unthinkable. Conclusion. The world of medieval torture represents one of humanity's darkest chapters. For centuries, European societies built elaborate systems for inflicting systematic pain and suffering, convincing themselves that this was not only necessary, but morally justified. These weren't random acts of cruelty by sadistic individuals. They were organized, legal, religiously sanctioned practices that entire communities participated in and supported. The sophistication of medieval torture techniques shows how much time, energy, and creativity humans can devote to causing suffering when they believe it serves a greater purpose. But the eventual abandonment of these practices also shows that moral progress is possible. The same species that created the Rack and the Iron Maiden also eventually developed concepts of human rights, due process, and the inherent dignity of all people. Understanding this history doesn't just satisfy our curiosity about the past, it serves as a warning about what humans are capable of when fear, authority, and moral certainty combine in toxic ways. The screams that once echoed through medieval torture chambers remind us why protecting individual rights and maintaining skepticism about authority remains so important today. The next time someone tells you that the good old days were better than today, remember what we've covered in this video. For all our modern problems, Most of us can go to sleep tonight without worrying about waking up in a medieval torture chamber. And that, honestly, is no small blessing. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of history's darkest subjects. If you found this video educational, make sure to like and subscribe for more content exploring the shadows of human history. And remember, understanding the past helps us build a better future.